He was never given a name. Not one single character in this entire show ever calls him anything but a title.
He saw me! The Night King!
Destroy the Night King.
Bran saw the Night King.
Fighting for the Night King.
Chance that we survive the Night King.
And here is the strangest part. Across 8 seasons, this character barely appears. Add up every scene he's actually in, and you get about 14 minutes. That's it. 14 minutes to become one of the most feared antagonists in modern television. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly who he was before he became this, why an entire war was fought just to contain him, and how the single most feared being in this story was undone in less time than it takes to blink, by someone nobody in that moment even saw coming. So let's start at the very beginning, because the truth about the Night King is a lot stranger and a lot more disturbing than most Game of Thrones fans realize. The man before the monster. Something tends to get lost in the shuffle of ice zombies and dragonfire. The Night King used to be a person, an actual man with a name we're never given, and a life that got taken from him in the worst possible way. This happened during what the show calls the Dawn Age, thousands of years before anything we watch on screen. Back then, Westeros belonged to the Children of the Forest. They were small, magical, deeply connected to the land, and they were losing their home. The first men had crossed over from Essos and were spreading across the continent, cutting down the weirwood trees the children considered sacred, clearing forests, and building settlements. It was a slow invasion, and the children were losing badly. So, the children did something desperate. We learn about this from a character named Leaf, one of the last of the Children of the Forest, when she explains it to Bran Stark in a cave beyond the wall.
We were at war. We were being slaughtered. Our sacred trees cut down. We needed to defend ourselves.
They needed a weapon, she tells him plainly, almost without emotion. Something that could turn the tide against the First Men. So they took a prisoner, a captured First Man, and they turned him into precisely that. The ritual itself is simple to describe and horrifying to picture. The children held the man down, and one of them drove a shard of dragon glass, that's obsidian, straight into his heart. His eyes turned blue, his skin went pale, cold, cracked like frost against stone. And when he opened his eyes again, he wasn't a prisoner anymore, he wasn't even really a man anymore. He was the first of the White Walkers. He would become the Night King. The Children of the Forest didn't set out to create an apocalypse, they just wanted the killing to stop. And what they got instead was something that would eventually threaten to end all life south of the Wall. But creating him was only step one. What came next actually built the legend, and it involves a war so old that almost nobody left alive even remembers it happened. The war that built a wall. Once the Night King existed, he didn't stay a lone soldier for long. The show never spells out the exact mechanics of how he built his army, whether he could turn others the same way he was turned, or whether something else was happening, but within an unknown but clearly vast stretch of time, an entire army of the dead had formed under his command. The White Walkers multiplied. The Whites, meaning the reanimated corpses that make up the bulk of his forces, spread by the thousands, and whatever the Children of the Forest thought they were unleashing to save themselves, it very quickly stopped listening to them entirely. This period is what the show and the wider mythology call the Long Night. It's referenced constantly throughout the series, almost like folklore, the kind of thing older characters bring up the way we might bring up something from ancient history we only half remember from school.
Fear is for the long night, when the sun hides for years.
A generation-long winter fell across Westeros, darkness that didn't lift. And walking through that darkness came an army that didn't feel pain, didn't tire, and didn't stop. The First Men and the Children of the Forest had been enemies. Actual, bitter enemies, fighting over land and trees and territory for who knows how long. But when the Night King's army started sweeping across the continent, that conflict became irrelevant almost overnight. You can't negotiate land rights with something that wants to kill every living thing it encounters. So the First Men and the Children did something neither side had probably considered before. They allied. Old wars, old grudges, all of it got shelved the second a bigger threat showed up. And even together they were losing. This is genuinely one of the more overlooked pieces of the show's mythology. Humanity's ancestors alongside the ancient magical people of the forest fighting side by side, and the undead army was still winning. It took something drastic to turn the tide. According to the legends passed down in-universe, a lord known as Brandon the Builder, yes, that Brandon, an ancestor of the Stark line, led the construction of an enormous structure of ice, stretching hundreds of miles across the northern edge of the continent. We know it today simply as the Wall.
Do you think my ancestors built a 700-foot wall of ice to keep out snow and savages? What does it keep out? Death.
It wasn't just a big chunk of ice stacked up to keep enemies out physically. According to what Bran witnesses in his visions, the children of the forest infused the structure with old magic, ancient spells woven directly into the ice itself, creating a barrier that the dead physically could not cross unless something broke that magic first. It wasn't a wall built to slow an army down, it was built to stop one permanently. And it worked. The long night ended. The Night King's forces were pushed back beyond the wall, into the far north, into the deep cold nobody wanted to follow them into. Humanity survived. The children of the forest, badly diminished, faded into obscurity, tucked away in the furthest corners of the world. And the Night King himself vanished from human memory, treated less like history and more like a bedtime story parents used to keep their children from wandering too far north. Thousands of years passed with the North believing this was nothing more than legend, an old tale to scare children into staying close to the fire. The wall stood. Generation after generation of the Night's Watch took their own vows and manned it, and almost nobody among them actually believed the thing they were supposedly guarding against was real. Until it very quietly started to become real again. And the first sign of it wasn't a battle or an invasion, it was something far more personal, happening in the home of a man most viewers already found unsettling long before anyone knew what he was really doing. The Reawakening. If you've watched the show, you know the name Craster. He's a wildling living just beyond the wall who's taken multiple wives, several of them his own daughters, and who has one deeply disturbing habit. Every time one of his wives gives birth to a son, the baby disappears. He tells everyone the boys simply die. Nobody in his household ever sees a body. For a long stretch of the show, this is presented almost as background horror, one more example of how brutal life beyond civilization can be. But eventually we learn the truth, and it's worse than anyone assumed. Craster has been giving his infant sons away. Not to wolves, not to the elements, he's been leaving them out in the snow as offerings, and something has been coming to collect them. We actually get to see what happens to at least one of these children directly, in a moment that a lot of longtime viewers point to as one of the show's quieter, more disturbing scenes. We watch a newborn baby left out in the cold night, and a White Walker rides in on a pale, undead horse and gently picks the infant up. There's no violence in the moment, and that's exactly what makes it land so hard. The Walker carries the baby off into the dark, and in a later scene we see where it was taken. Laid down on a stone altar, surrounded by more White Walkers, with the Night King himself standing over it. He presses a single finger to the child's face, and the boy's eyes turn that same unmistakable icy blue. Another White Walker created. Another life absorbed entirely into his ranks. This confirms, for anyone who hadn't pieced it together yet, that the ancient threat from thousands of years ago never actually went away. It just went quiet, and it had been quietly building its numbers the entire time, using the desperation and cruelty of people living on the fringes of civilization to keep feeding itself new recruits. What's genuinely unsettling is the method. He's not marching south with an army immediately. He's patient. He's been patient for millennia. He's accepting sacrifices from a broken man who can't even look at what he's doing, and slowly, quietly growing his ranks one child at a time while the rest of the world tells itself bedtime stories about how none of this is real anymore. And soon, that patience was about to run out, because word was starting to spread, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, actual living men were about to see this threat with their own eyes, in numbers too large to explain away or ignore. What happened next at a wildling settlement called Hardhome would become one of the single most talked about sequences in the show's entire run. And it's the moment the Night King stopped being a rumor and became something the whole world would eventually have to face. Hardhome. By this point in the story, Jon Snow has become Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and he's trying to do something almost nobody before him had bothered to attempt. Unite the Night's Watch with the wildlings, the free folk living beyond the wall, against the threat neither side can survive alone. It's a controversial move within its own ranks. Plenty of his brothers in black see the wildlings as the enemy, full stop, people who've raided and killed for generations. But Jon understands something they don't yet. None of those old feuds are going to matter once the dead start walking. So he sails to a settlement called Hardhome, a crowded, desperate refuge where thousands of wildlings have gathered, hoping to negotiate safe passage south of the wall before winter fully arrives. And in the middle of these negotiations, something happens that nobody in that camp is prepared for. The temperature drops, fast. Fog rolls in off the water, thick and unnatural. And then from somewhere in that fog comes the sound of a horn. A long, low, guttural call that every free folk person in that camp recognizes instantly, and reacts to with pure, immediate terror. What follows is chaos. The dead arrive at Hardhome not as a slow, plodding horde, but as an overwhelming wave, crashing into a camp that never stood a chance of holding them back. People who'd just been negotiating for their lives moments earlier are suddenly fighting for them in the most literal sense, and losing badly. Jon Snow himself ends up in direct combat, and this is actually where we learn something crucial about Valyrian steel. It's one of the only materials capable of actually killing a White Walker outright, rather than just damaging it. Jon's sword, Longclaw, has a Valyrian steel blade, and when he uses it against one of the walkers in the chaos, the creature doesn't just fall, it shatters completely, disintegrating into ice and frost in an instant. It's a small but massive revelation buried in the middle of an overwhelming battle sequence. But the true gut punch of Hardhome isn't the fight itself, it's what happens after. As the surviving wildlings scramble towards boats, desperate to escape across the water, the camera pulls back to a cliff's edge overlooking the massacre. And there he is, the Night King, standing perfectly still amid the wreckage of the battle he's just won, watching the survivors flee. And then, without a single word, without any dramatic build-up, he simply raises his arms. And the dead who'd just been killed in that very battle, the bodies of wildlings who moments earlier had been fighting for their lives, begin to rise. Not just a few of them, all of them. Every corpse on that battlefield stands back up at once, eyes flicking open in unison, now permanently part of his forces. It's one thing to lose a battle, it's another thing entirely to watch your own dead get instantly conscripted into the army that just killed them. And then there's the moment that quietly turns this from a battle scene into something much more personal. As the last boats pull away from the shore, the Night King turns his head and looks directly at Jon Snow. Not at the retreating soldiers, not at the chaos behind them, at Jon specifically. It's a brief exchange, just a few seconds of eye contact across a widening stretch of water, but it lands like a promise. This isn't over. This was never going to be a one-time thing. Jon has just become someone the Night King is aware of, specifically, personally, and that's not a comforting position to be in. Hardhome is the moment the threat stops being folklore for the people actually living through this story. It's confirmed, witnessed, undeniable, and devastating. But even after everything the survivors saw there, nobody yet understood just how directly this war was about to become personal for one particular family. Because beyond the wall, in a cave full of ancient magic, someone else was about to have a face-to-face encounter with the Night King that would change absolutely everything about how this war would eventually be fought and won. The Mark. While all of this is unfolding, Bran Stark has been beyond the wall, training under the Three-Eyed Raven, learning to access the Raven's power to see into the past, the present, and occasionally glimpses of what's still to come. During one of these sessions, Bran wargs into a vision that shows him something the Raven never intended for him to see so directly. The Night King's army itself, gathered together, waiting. And as Bran watches from within the vision, the Night King suddenly turns and looks straight at him, as though he can somehow sense he's being watched from across the distance. He reaches out and grabs Bran's arm. Bran is pulled back to the present in shock, and there on his actual arm is a mark, cold to the touch, left behind by something that reached him through a vision that was never supposed to be able to touch him at all. It's a deeply unsettling moment precisely because of what it implies. This isn't a memory or a piece of history he's observing from a safe distance. The Night King is aware, present, and now, somehow, capable of reaching through Bran's visions and leaving something behind in a real world. It doesn't take long for the consequences of that mark to become clear. The Night King's forces locate the cave where Bran has been sheltering, and this time it isn't a vision. It's an army at the door. The cave comes under direct assault. The children of the forest, along with the very last members of Bran's protective group, fight desperately to hold the entrance, and most of them don't survive it. Leaf, the very same child of the forest to explain the Night King's origin to Bran, sacrifices herself covering their escape. The three-eyed raven himself is killed defending Bran directly, giving him just enough time to be pulled out of danger. That mark, it turns out, does more than simply make Bran easy to find. It strips away the ancient protective magic surrounding places like the cave and eventually the wall itself, places that had been shielded by old spells for thousands of years, kept safe specifically from things like the Night King. The mark effectively acts like a key. It's a chilling reversal of what we might expect from a horror antagonist. He didn't need brute force to break every barrier standing in his way. He needed one specific person, marked in one specific way, and everything protecting humanity for millennia would eventually start to crumble because of it. Bran survives the encounter, evacuated with help from his direwolf and eventually Bran Stark, who'd himself once been captured and partially transformed by the Night King's forces before being freed. But the damage, so to speak, was already done. The Night King now had a way through defenses that had held for thousands of years, and it wouldn't take long for him to use it. Because not long after this encounter, the Night King set his sights on something even more consequential than a single cave. He set his sights on the wall itself, and to bring it down, he needed something that, up until this point, nobody watching this story had ever considered a real possibility. A weapon that could fly. The fall of the wall. By this stage of the story, dragons have very much re-entered the world, thanks to Daenerys Targaryen, and one particular scene brings these two forces, fire and ice, into direct conflict for the first time. Jon Snow and a small group venture beyond the wall specifically to capture a White, hoping to bring physical proof of the threat south to convince skeptical rulers that this war is real. The mission succeeds, but only barely, and it ends with the group trapped on a frozen lake, surrounded by the Night King's forces with seemingly no way out. Daenerys arrives with her dragons to rescue them, and for a moment it looks like overwhelming firepower might finally turn the tide against this ancient enemy. And then the Night King does something nobody expected. He picks up a spear, an enormous crafted weapon of ice, and hurls it at one of the dragons in the sky. Viserion, one of Daenerys' three dragons, takes the hit directly and plummets into the frozen lake below, sinking beneath the ice. It's already a gut-wrenching moment on its own. A dragon, one of the most powerful living creatures in the entire world, brought down by a single throw. But what happens afterward is what actually escalates this entire war into something far more dangerous than anyone had planned for. Sometime later, the Night King and his forces return to that same lake, and they raise Viserion's body from beneath the ice. What emerges is no longer simply a dead dragon, it's been reanimated, transformed the same way every other creature under the Night King's control has been transformed. Its eyes now burn that same pale blue. Its flesh has gone cold and pale, cracked like frost. And when it opens its mouth, instead of the orange fire it once breathed in real life, it exhales flame that burns an icy pale blue instead. The Night King now has a dragon, and he uses it almost immediately for exactly the purpose you'd expect. The wall, that ancient, magically fortified barrier that had held for thousands of years, that had stopped the long night in its tracks and kept humanity safe for countless generations, comes down in a matter of moments. The undead Viserion flies along its length and simply melts straight through it with blue fire, carving out an opening wide enough for an army of the dead to march through unimpeded. Thousands of years of defense, undone in a single flight. Every strategy humanity had relied on, every reason the North had felt at least somewhat protected, depended on that wall holding. And it took the Night King reclaiming a piece of technology, so to speak, that had only just been introduced into this world weeks earlier to erase all of it in one pass. With the wall breached and an undead dragon now flying at his command, the Night King's forces marched south for the first time in recorded history. No longer contained, no longer a rumor from beyond a border nobody crossed. This was the beginning of the endgame, and it would lead directly to the single largest, most brutal confrontation the show ever put on screen. A battle that would determine whether humanity survived at all. The Battle of Winterfell. With the wall gone and the Night King's army marching unopposed toward the heart of the North, the remaining forces of Westeros, Northern Houses, the Unsullied, the Dothraki, and what remained of Daenerys' dragons, gathered at Winterfell for what everyone involved understood might be humanity's last stand. There wasn't a plan beyond holding the line and hoping it was enough. The battle begins with the Dothraki cavalry, their curved arcs set alight, charging out into the darkness to meet the approaching army head-on. In one of the most quietly devastating pieces of visual storytelling in the entire series, we don't actually watch the fight happen. We simply watch those points of flame charge forward into the dark, and then, one by one, without a single sound of triumph or retreat, they start going out. Light after light, snuffed into nothing until there's no fire left at all. An entire cavalry force gone, in the span of about 10 seconds, without the audience ever seeing a single clash of weapons. From there, it becomes an overwhelming, chaotic fight for survival. Wave after wave of whites crash against Winterfell's defenses. Fire trenches meant to hold the line get snuffed out prematurely. Soldiers who die in battle rise again moments later as whites themselves, forcing their former allies to fight people they'd been standing beside minutes earlier. It's a relentless, exhausting sequence, meant to feel less like a heroic battle and more like a slow, grinding fight against inevitability. And through all of it, the Night King himself barely participates directly. He doesn't need to. He rides Viserion above the battlefield and eventually lands within the walls of Winterfell's Godswood, walking calmly toward the one target that actually matters to him, Bran Stark, sitting alone beneath the same weirwood tree where the three-eyed raven once resided.
That's true. He'll never expose himself.
Yes, he will. He'll come for me. He's tried before, many times with many three-eyed ravens.
This is where the whole battle reframes itself in hindsight. The endless waves of whites, the overwhelming assault on the walls, the chaos consuming every other character in the story. All of it was essentially a distraction, or at least secondary, to the Night King's actual goal. He wasn't there to conquer Winterfell for his own sake. He was there for Bran specifically, the same Bran he'd marked years earlier, the one person whose abilities represented something the Night King seemed determined to erase entirely. Theon Greyjoy, who'd spent much of the show earning back some measure of honor after a long and difficult arc, makes a final stand here, leading a small group in a desperate attempt to protect Bran directly. It doesn't work. The Night King's whites overwhelm Theon's forces one by one, and eventually Theon himself charges the Night King directly in a last, doomed act of loyalty. The Night King doesn't even bother drawing a weapon. He simply catches Theon's spear as it comes toward him, and ends the fight without a single wasted motion. And with nothing left standing between him and Bran, the Night King walks forward, calm, unhurried, exactly like someone finishing something he started years before this moment. Every bit of chaos happening elsewhere in Winterfell fades into background noise against this one quiet, almost intimate confrontation. And it's precisely at this moment, the moment that felt like it was building toward an inevitable, tragic conclusion, that the entire war changed in less time than it takes to read this sentence. The end of the Night King. Nobody in that Godswood saw it coming. Not Bran, not Theon's remaining men, and especially not millions of viewers at home. As he stands over Bran, seemingly seconds from finally finishing what he started, a figure drops down from above, silent, fast, and drives a dagger directly into his chest. Arya Stark. Nobody had tracked her getting there. That was entirely the point. Earlier in the story, she'd been given a Valyrian steel dagger, the very same one that had once been used in an attempt on Bran's own life years earlier, long before any of this war had reached Winterfell. That weapon had passed through several hands over the course of the show, always feeling like a minor, half-forgotten detail, and it turned out to be the exact tool needed to end a threat that had existed for thousands of years. The moment itself happens almost too fast to process the first time you watch it. There's no drawn-out final battle between Arya and the Night King, no exchange of blows, no dramatic build-up once she appears. She catches the blade in her free hand mid-fall after the Night King reflexively grabs her wrist, and in one continuous motion switches it to her other hand and drives it straight into him before he can react. And then, silence. The Night King's body doesn't slump over, or bleed, or do anything you'd expect from a killing blow. Instead, cracks spread across him instantly, spiderwebbing outward from the wound, and within a second or two his entire body shatters into ice and disperses into nothing, carried off by the wind like frost off a window. And then, in one of the most satisfying chain reactions the show ever delivered, the effect doesn't stop with him. Every White Walker across the battlefield shatters in the exact same instant, and every single White, the countless corpses that had made up the overwhelming bulk of his army, collapses lifelessly to the ground all at once. The entire army, built and expanded over thousands of years, ends in the span of a single heartbeat, because it turns out the whole structure depended entirely on the man at the top of it. All those centuries of dread, the long night, the wall, Hardhome, the mark on Bran, the loss of Viserion, and all of it built toward a threat that in the end could be undone by a single well-placed dagger in the hands of someone who wasn't even fighting in the main battle. Arya wasn't at Winterfell's front gate. She wasn't holding a defensive line. She was moving quietly, deliberately, exactly the way she'd been trained to for years, and she arrived at precisely the one place in that entire battlefield that mattered most. There's something worth noting about how the show chose to end this particular threat. Not with the most powerful characters, not with dragons or armies or Valyrian steel swords swung by seasoned warriors, but with patience, precision, and a single decisive strike from someone the Night King never saw as a threat until it was already too late. Regardless, in my opinion, Jon Snow should be the one to kill him, but you let me know your thoughts in the comments. And just like that, a threat that had loomed over this world since before recorded history, that had survived the fall of empires and the rise of new ones, that had patiently built an army over thousands of years while the rest of the continent argued over thrones and succession and old family grudges, ended in less time than it takes to blink. That's the story of the Night King, created out of desperation by people trying to save their home, built into a legend that outlasted every kingdom that ever feared him, and ended, in the end, not by fire, not by an army, but by one girl who simply refused to be seen until it was already far too late for him to do anything about it. If you made it this far, you clearly love diving into the details of this world as much as I do. Let me know down in the comments which moment in this story hit you hardest, and if you want more deep dives like this one, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.